You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Welcome to this episode of Leading the Factory Forward. This is episode number 78, and it's entitled A Leader's Communications During Uncertain Times with Russ Walker. At Leading the Factory Forward, our goal is to help you create a compelling future for yourself, your teams, and your organization. I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode, and you can use that as a tool to capture notes as you start exploring the topics of this episode. Or to help you get started on your journey and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 steps you need for a more productive workday. Well, in this episode, I'm very pleased to have with us Russ Walker. Russ has over 30 years of communications experience with a Fortune Top 100 firm. He has provided leadership in corporate communications, executive communications, external business communications, acquisitions and integration support, sustainability programs, public relations, and crisis management. So again, a great wealth of information, and we really look forward to having Russ with us today. Some of the talking points we're going to share is what has been a business leader's communication over the last year, what's changed, what's different, and what should they be doing now to position their companies for the coming year. There are going to be such topics as clarifying your business purpose, developing a narrative about how your business is addressing sustainability. Then we'll talk about who do you need to be talking to. Current employees, suppliers, future talent, local community leaders. So let's start our conversation with Russ. Well, again, welcome to Russ Walker, and we're really pleased to have you here today, Russ. And just to give you a chance to introduce yourself and some of the experience you bring.
Hi, thanks, Lynn, for having me on. I've spent about a little over 30 years working in communications. For the first 20 or so, I was in the advertising side of things as a writer and managing various pieces of the advertising. But the last dozen years in the corporate communications and corporate PR space, I've worked with the employee communication side, investors communications, as well as public communications.
Yeah, and I think some of our audience is people who are in small, medium-sized companies. They need to communicate, but they don't have a staff or a person like you to help them do it. So I know you can probably provide some great insights to them on at least things they could consider as they talk to the public or their employees.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, there's a lot of art to the communication side of things, but there are also some science and knowing what's going to work when, having the numbers to back it up, having the processes developed in order to make sure that the right message is getting out to the right audience at the right time.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we could start with what's your take on the current environment we have around communications?
So it's been quite a year for every area, even in the communications. One that has many leaders kind of rethinking or revising what they should be saying to their employees, their investors, their community. What's important for them to hear right now is different than it may have been a year ago. And it's not just what, it's how they will be communicating and should they be communicating to their teams. That has all changed in the last year.
Yeah, I can imagine that, one, people tend to be remote now, at least in some cases. But two, I'm sure they're all anxious to kind of hear what's next or what their leader thinks is next.
Yeah, a year ago, things were pretty normal. Advertising and promotions were still operating in a fairly predictable fashion. Leaders were able to communicate to employees face to face. And recruiting, although it was already a challenge, it was happening in a lot of the traditional methods. A month later, things started to unravel. From a communication standpoint, is businesses rushed to keep their employees safe while also communicating to those employees the changes in the processes that needed to take place. Many leaders, for one, realized that a lot of their communications tools weren't very resilient to these changes. They didn't have a method to regularly communicate to employees who were working remote. Others learned that they needed to communicate a lot more often because employees were a little afraid of the unknown. So those things from an employee communications really evolved over the first 6 months of the COVID-19 crisis. promotion efforts, for the most part, companies either held back or they learned that they better hold back and rethink their promotional efforts, because it was very easy for a company to appear tone deaf, to run a gimmick or promotion at a time when people are just glued to the TV around the news. Chances are that's not going to work real well, and you're spending a lot of money that's actually going to negatively impact your brand. Those who relied on trade shows for their leads, those trade shows didn't exist anymore. And as much as trade shows tried to create the virtual show, they don't deliver the same way that, standing there in a booth with your customer face to face. They just didn't perform as well. So those companies needed to find other channels. Social media efforts, that was always changing. But again, those haven't performed the same since February, March of 2020. Some campaigns, some efforts have performed better. Others perform worse. And as I say, the social media efforts were some of the early ones that basically showed companies can either have their ear to the ground or know what's going on in the mind of customers, and those that are tone deaf. So social media really, it's an early testing ground for a lot of that.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed in talking to small and medium-sized companies is they needed to get out a message that, hey, we're still in business.
Oh, yeah.
Because people were worried. Their news said the supply chains were disrupted and everything. And yet many, especially the manufacturing arena, said, hey, we're still delivering, and people didn't even know that. So I know they had to work to try to communicate even that to people.
You're right. I mean, being open for business and hopefully still hiring. Those are messages that need to be communicated to not just employees, but community leaders and trade media. Those people need to know kind of the status of company X. The more they understand kind of the current situation, the more they're going to be able to help you out as well. So obviously, there's the blocking and tackling communications that need to be done, the process changes that need to be happening for employees. And then there's the impact on the community that needs to be shared with the community leaders. But as I say, that the audiences are all still the same audiences. The message, though, is likely changing, and the way you're telling that story is changing.
So when you think of the communications by company owners or leaders, if you said, well, the leader was going to make a speech a year and a half ago to the public about something, what are the key things you think might be different if you were doing that, a month or so ago?
Right now, leaders need to take a pause and make sure they have kind of clarity of purpose and know what their storyline is. Purpose, I think Simon Sinek in his book, Start with the Why, that really is a key. Make sure employees know why we're here. Why should the employees come to work? Why do the customers need you? Why does the broader population need you? I mean, how is the world a better place because your company exists? I know that sounds lofty, but this is an opportunity to kind of hit reset a bit. And that's important because, again, employees are wondering what's next. And we're in this COVID crisis now for over a year, but they're still wondering what's next. And getting them to believe in the why is so important. And I mentioned kind of the company storyline or the narrative around sustainability. Sustainability, I kind of hate that word because it means so many things that it almost means nothing. But it's one that's talked a lot about because it hits on the key pieces of what's going to keep this company running financially. How are they doing financially? How are they doing for the world, the environment? Are they a negative? Are they a parasite and sucking the life out of the resources, or are they trying to improve? And then the third is kind of the social aspect. Are they a good citizen of their community, of the country, the world? So the purpose, it needs to be a shared purpose. It needs to be something that not just the leader can own, but the employees need to own that purpose. The customers need to own that purpose. Everyone needs to kind of buy into this as to why are we here? And it needs to be bigger than, of course, it's a financial. We all like to have our jobs, but we need to have a purpose or reason for being, because there's always an employer who can likely afford to pay more. And so that's not your reason for being.
Well, and you get to a key point there, I think, is that whole idea around, again, talking to small, medium, and even large-sized companies. Talent is still an issue. Even in these times where people may not have jobs, they still need a lot of talent. So I would suspect that purpose can be a real plus on the talent attraction side.
Yeah, if you get the purpose and kind of your narrative down, are things employees want to know or recruits want to know. But right now, employers should continue to focus on their employee messages. Make sure you revisit, remind them of the benefits that they're being paid or given. Keep them informed, not guessing. The other audience, as you mentioned, is the recruits or the prospective employees. Got to continue to focus on that talent search, but that should really come after making sure that you're doing what you need to keep the employees engaged. And then lastly, staying connected with those local leaders and chamber and suppliers.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I've noticed that in our local community here, that whether it be finding PPE or organizing, now, of course, it's organizing vaccinations, but there seems to have been a lot more interaction with the community by companies simply because we all need to help each other out in this thing.
You're right. And the more the leader in the company can be engaged in being the solution to the problem and not just being on silent mode, the better the company is going to be. Like you say, if that means being a collection site or you have a parking lot that could be available, by all means, stay engaged in the community. And I know there's so many other things that leaders need to be focused on, but that community engagement will pay dividends down the road.
Mm-hmm. So I know some of your work had to do with telling the company story. And I know on a couple occasions it was historical type stories. But what are key elements as a company says, this is what we are, this is what we're about, this is where we've been? Some of the things that you recall from your work.
Oh, well, I mean, the historical stuff is great, but it only gets you so far. Not every company is the same, but if you have a rich history, it's important to show that. It may be a little bit of a differentiator, but it needs to be a reason why you're in this for the long haul. You're not going to be closing your doors overnight, but it's too easy to get trapped into falling in love with your own history. And the reality is most people don't care that much. It's more, what are you doing going forward? So, the message is externally. Again, it's very good to tell the history story. If, for example, as a company, you have a history in philanthropy, or you've been supporting this organization, this nonprofit organization for 50 years. I mean, those little milestone things are very important because they're proof points, if you will, that the company is going to be there. And that all falls into the sustainability message, that you're running a good business. And by the way, you've been a good business for a long time and you're taking care of the environment. You're not polluting the waterways. You're doing all these things. And by the way, here's proof we've been doing this for 50 years or however long. And again, it doesn't need to be 50 years ago. It could have been a big effort you did 2 years ago. Is the proof point to say, look, we've been doing this for a while and we're going to continue to do this. You see the sustainability message popping up a lot now. The big companies, GM just announced that they're only going to be producing electric cars by 2035. That's part of their sustainability message. They're pointing an arrow at electric vehicles and saying that's where we're going. And, now stakeholders will be focused on that message for the next 15 years to see if GM's progressing in that area. So, as I say, the history side of things is great as long as it's being used as a proof point that you're going to be here for a while.
Sure. Thinking, as you said, about moving forward, as we look into 2021 now, what thoughts have occurred to you as far as what leaders should be focusing on in communications in our next steps now that we may be coming out of the pandemic? And yet we're still in it too. So what thoughts occur to you that leaders should kind of keep in mind?
Well, this winter's been an interesting one from a political standpoint. The one thing I will say is it probably will happen anyway, but avoid getting into the politics as a company. If there's a strategic reason to be involved one way or another, great, but it tends to be a no-win situation in most cases. And again, there are exceptions, but it tends to be a no-win situation for most. Take this opportunity as we get into 2021 to really focus on what's your crisis plan. COVID, yes, we'll be living in COVID shadow for a while, but it won't be the last crisis that impacts your company. So you won't be able to predict everything, but there are probably things companies in your industry have had to deal with, whether it's a workplace fatality or an environmental disaster. Make sure you have a bit of a playbook assembled, because if those situations happen, you won't be able to create the messages and processes in the moment. You really need to have a playbook established so that everyone knows their role and you can basically act quickly. And as I mentioned earlier on the sustainability message, being a good company that is good for the environment, good for the community, and yes, a good business, those messages, strengthen them, build your story. I mean, if you haven't really given any thought to the sustainability message, figure out what you're going to tackle in 2021 so that you have something to talk about in 2022.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Russ. This has been very informative, and I really appreciate your inputs and your insights. Any final thoughts as we kind of wrap up our conversation today?
Thank you, Lynn. I think 2021 is going to be an exciting year, and it'll be good to get back to some sense of normalcy. But the reality is things are always going to be changing, and the best thing a leader can do right now is be prepared.
Great. Okay. Well, again, many thanks, Russ, and appreciate you being on our podcast. And I'll leave your contact information also in the notes of the podcast. So if people want to reach out to you, they can check in with you. And again, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Lynn.
Again, my deepest thanks to Russ for sharing his insights and knowledge on becoming great at employee communications. Again, quick recap. We talked about what has happened in the past year for business leaders in communication. What should leaders be doing now to better position their companies for the coming year? What are some of the things that you need to do, such as clarifying your business purpose, developing a narrative around how your business is addressing sustainability? And finally, who do you need to be talking to? Not only your current employees, your suppliers, but potentially future talent and certainly local community leaders. So what's up next for Leading the Factory Forward? We're going to continue a mix of solo episodes and a lot of interviews with experts, some in manufacturing, but also some in areas that can really help you build your business. Also, in at least 1 or 2 episodes during the month, I'll be sharing my thoughts and ideas or interviews on people that are becoming a silver entrepreneur and how the silver entrepreneur talent might be able to help you in your business. And as always, I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode as you start exploring the ideas of this episode. Or to help you get started on your journey and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. Thanks for listening.